Decided it wasn't going to try to be cool. The management team wasn't particularly young, no insult to anyone in the room. The management team didn't try to be cool, and they weren't in Silicon Valley. But yet, somehow, through committed vision and hard work, they succeeded. So we'd like to welcome today as our keynote speaker, Rodney Rogers, CEO of Virtustream, which was just acquired in the last few days, probably still in the process of acquisition by EMC for $1.2 billion. Rodney is here to talk about the vision of the company and how to create a blue-collar, uncool unicorn. Rodney?
Good morning. So thanks for spending a little time this morning to hear our story and such. And I think Roger might have framed it well. We kind of wear who we are with a badge of pride, and we'll talk a little bit about that, have a little bit of fun with it this morning. So just a little bit about me first, just who I am and who's standing before you speaking. Back in 2000, it was about 12 years ago, I was giving a talk at one of the shareholder LP meetings for one of my venture capital firms. And the person that went on stage before me referred to himself as a serial entrepreneur. This was in 2004, 2005. So my first company we built through the burst of the first tech bubble in 2000, through the aftermath of 9/11, through the 2002 recession. And I remember those 4 years were just freaking miserable. And I remember thinking to myself, why on earth would anybody do this again? And so I stand before you today as a serial entrepreneur. Can't quite explain it. It's a bit of an addictive thing. I was a co-founder and CEO of a company called Adjoined. Our claim to fame is we were known as the fastest growing IT services firm based in the U.S. between 2000 and 2007. We sold that company to a publicly traded company, Canbay, which was largely an offshore-based company. I became the chief operating officer and the named successor to the CEO. We did a cash stock deal, so we had a lot at stake that we rolled into that deal quite publicly at that time. And in somewhat of an unexpected situation, we were acquired by Capgemini, ironically, for $1.2 billion back in 2006. In early 2008 or 2007, in early 2008, I kind of ran Capgemini, one of Capgemini's largest P&Ls in North America in 2007. In early 2008, I was 42 and attempted, sort of semi-retirement. I was going to kind of cool it down, just invest in things, advise, sit on boards, do that kind of stuff. And I failed at that in 3 weeks. I was absolutely miserable at it. I didn't understand daytime TV. I'm not that good at golf. So I called up my co-founder at Adjoined, my CTO, Kevin Reed, and this was in early mid-2008. I said to Kevin, I was like, dude, we got to build another one of these things, and this cloud looks interesting. This cloud thing looks interesting. And that's literally how we came up with it. That was literally the first conversation and the genesis of Virtustream. You can find me on Twitter, RJRogers87. I don't even have a cool Twitter handle. I had never heard the term Clouderati until mid-2011 when I finally got onto Twitter, so I was kind of late with all that stuff as well. And I'm a board member and investor in a number of companies I'm also quite excited about. So you want to get into the cloud, right? So it was late 2008, AWS's EC2 is just kind of coming into, I'd say, mainstream IT awareness from that standpoint. We really took a look at what they had pioneered and admired it greatly. The concept of true multi-tenancy elasticity and economics sitting behind a high degree of automation and ubiquitous access. This was disruptive. This was, really something. However, we knew that we wanted to take those core principles, those core architectural concepts, and actually apply them to an enterprise use case. And the thing that we didn't see a lot of at that time was companies looking to solve the problem specifically of IO-intensive, mission-critical type applications running on true cloud architectures. Private cloud was just sort of coming into being then. VCE was coming into formation, things of that nature. And you saw a lot of, sort of the early days of cloud washing where companies would take that cloud label and slap it on essentially a dedicated rack of hardware. So we were determined not to do that as well. And so we ultimately wanted to combine the scalability and the economics of true multi-tenant architectures, access, automation with the concepts of performance assured and highly secure environments. And that was really the concept. That was really what our original mission was with Virtustream. If you think back, AWS really made the market in the public cloud, and they made that market really providing ubiquitous access to infrastructure for development of apps, right? For these largely, generally compute-intensive, highly scalable apps where your interface between the database and the application is of relative minimal complexity, but you're doing it 1,000,000 times an hour. You need distributed points of failure. You need all the things associated with scalable architectures to make that work. And, we sort of looked at that, admired it, knew we weren't that. And, we had grown up in our lives selling to the Fortune 500 CIO and CTO suite. And, we looked at the enterprise, the Fortune 500 enterprise landscape, and about 70% of their spend, and to this day is about the same number, was spent on infrastructure supporting IO-intensive, more stateful type of applications. Typically in that landscape, at its heart or at its core, you have an enterprise application such as an SAP or an Oracle or something of a core business application. Then you have a variety of tenured web apps or other apps that interface around that core order-to-cash system. Whether they're highly scalable elastic web apps or whether they're dusty 5-7-year .NET apps that are for recipe management, workflow, transportation management, doesn't matter. There's an ecosystem of apps there. And nobody was really focused on building a scalable, highly automated, true cloud solution for that with performance SLAs and performance assurity, I should say, at that time, highly secure and the like. And that's ultimately what we set out to do. The type of engineering problem is associated with high degrees of data transaction between the application and the database, multi-tiered, it's conditional. You need to maintain acute states of persistence. If you lose your application while you're shipping or while you're invoicing, you have to recover to that exact point in time versus you lose your iPhone battery in the middle of a tweet, you'll rewrite the 70 characters. So just a different engineering problem. No less respect for the distributed system use case. This was just a use case associated with really kind of the scale-up app and placing that app in a true cloud architecture. And that's really the genesis of what Virtustream was born. And when I kind of walk through our technology, I'll talk a little bit about what we invented in a software layer to essentially solve that engineering problem. And one of the other great motivations at the time is if you really want to, we knew we were going to be venture backed at the end of the day, and if you ultimately want to create venture capital suicide, you would start out by building a general purpose infrastructure as a service offering and compete with the industry titans. That's sort of a ridiculous, absurd concept. I marveled at a number of the companies that were doing that back then. You really have to have not only a software architectural reason to exist to compete with the guys that are spending $1 billion a quarter on infrastructure, but you also have to have some performance and characteristics of that platform that just highly differentiates. Building a general purpose IaaS is essentially not the way to go, and that's why the mountain climber fell off the cliff, I guess. So, raising capital, our story is a little bit unique. And, typically the way you do this is not really a general way you do this, at least maybe back at that time. Things have gone a little bit crazy in the era of the private IPO now. But you'll typically, and I did this in my prior life, you'll raise $5 million of capital, you'll write some code, you'll come up with a product concept, you'll raise a Series B to commercialize it, to ultimately really productize it, take that, beta and turn it into a GA'd software product and ultimately get out there and sell it. A lot of folks in our business tend to fall down at that Series B stage because I've seen so much lost technical brilliance in venture-backed technology. Great engineering really, really poor ways of, and really a high degree of inability to commercialize it and really proliferate it as a viable and sustainable commercial business. And then if you're lucky, you get to, if you get past the point of proving yourself, you can raise a C, D, whatever, and be on your way, and hopefully you'll scale it if you're lucky. The way we did this was precisely the opposite way. I was utterly convinced that if we weren't recognized as an IP leader in this sort of enterprise-defined or enterprise-class type of cloud software and services space, within 5 years, we would be utterly irrelevant. And I fundamentally believe that that was true. So we raised a very large Series A $50 million Series A, and I wasn't really so much focused on valuation. There's a whole science to this, and there's blogs, and there's so much out there in the social medium about how you should go about raising capital. I'm one of those believers that for many folks, when you're raising your initial round of capital, focusing on valuation is one of actually the least important things associated with that. Terms and the amount of capital you raise relative to your mission at hand are really in my opinion, the important drivers. So we raised a $50 million A and started furiously writing software. And it's not easy to raise a $50 million A. I'll tell you a little bit about more of that on the next slide or two. But we actually took down our funding over our B and C because we were sort of really becoming balance sheet independent from venture equity. A lot of people hear the word debt, and you assume the word debt is a bad thing. In venture-backed growth companies, debt's actually a good thing, as long as you take down a responsible amount of it. But fundamentally, if you're able to pull down debt, you're minimizing the amount of equity capital you're pulling down from VCs, and you're minimizing your dilution as management. So in that B and C round, we established ourselves as enough of a company where we were debt worthy. And that's something that, again, I don't think a lot of entrepreneurs think about or focus about enough. And then in 2013, we actually raised a higher Series D. That, after we sort of established ourselves, that was a function of really a strategic partner in SAP invested in us, the software company. And, the valuation was the right number at that time. So I'll never forget this. The date that we first pitched Virtustream is the second half of 2008 before we really incorporated. It was the day we failed to pass the TARP bill, if anybody remembers that, the Troubled Asset Relief Program bill through Congress. And my first pitch was actually in Washington, D.C. I remember being through this or going in the meeting, kind of looking at my phone. The Dow was down 770 points. I was thinking to myself, it's like, this is like this just couldn't be worse. But I remember going through security and Reagan, we were with a lot of the congressmen. They were just happening to go through security, and they were talking about how they really stood up and didn't succumb to the pressures of business and all this stuff. And it was just like somebody beating me with a stick after the meeting all the way through security. But at the end of the day, we were successful in doing this, and it's a bit unique in the sense that we raised $50 million in this extraordinarily difficult time. It was a period of time where not a lot of venture-backed players in our space were able to raise capital. So we had a burden of making that relevant. We could have blasted through $50 million in this space and not had anything to show for it, but we did well. And ultimately, we had the track record of having handed our founding venture capital firm, a big check from their prior lives. Or from our prior companies, some of the companies that you saw in this was my third go around the track here. And when you tend to return money to VCs, they tend to back the next thing that you do. They tend to call you an entrepreneur in residence and give you a business card. If you lose VCs money, they tend to burn an effigy of you in the parking lot. So there's kind of like nothing in between there, and we were fortunate to be kind of on the good side of that. So we leveraged that. And shortly thereafter, I would say in Cloudland, everything was great. One of the things, as I mentioned earlier, we were a little bit oblivious to kind of the cooler stuff going on in the cloud at that time. We were the bit of the antithesis of the Silicon Valley hipster in that sense. We just didn't pay any attention to any of that stuff. We didn't build slides in our offices. We didn't buy purple couches or weird, games and stuff like that. we just focused on writing software and selling it to Fortune 500 companies. And again, I think, you know, if there's any bit of advice I give to younger entrepreneurs today is just, man, you just got to stay focused, because all the engineering doesn't matter unless you're going to sell it to somebody, unless you're going to sell your product to somebody, because at the end of the day, you generally don't get away with anything else. So, you know, we wore, as Roger said earlier, we kind of wore this badge with a bit of pride. You know, we were an East Coast firm, a couple of middle-aged co-founders, and you know, fundamentally, we were enterprise-focused as opposed to consumer technology-focused. Our core go-to-market, our core product management, our core input to the product development was really all about how the Fortune 500 enterprise would use cloud computing, right? At the end of the day, we were headquartered in Bethesda, Maryland. If you're going to pick a city, the least cool city to, you know, headquarter a cloud company, it would probably be Bethesda, Maryland, suburb of Washington, D.C. But at the end of the day, you know, it worked. It worked out well. You know, Virtustream's 6 years old, and I tell people I haven't slept in 6 years. First couple of years, I didn't sleep because I wasn't sure our product was going to work. The middle 2 years, I didn't work. 2011, 2012, selling cloud solutions into the Fortune 500 was sort of like pushing a boulder up a hill with a piece of string. Nobody bought it. People would look at us out of a state, you know, sort of due to morbid curiosity and things of that nature. And building it without a brand, established brand against, you know, the big guys out there was tough. And in the last 2 years, I didn't sleep because, you know, our demand has exploded. So, you know, I go to bed at night and wake up the next morning thinking about how we don't tip over and ultimately service this business. So, you know, as you go through these things, you're racked with self-doubt. It all sounds great today, but going through the middle of that, you know, we went through our naders, and you know, the lesson there is just kind of straighten up your tie, even if you don't know the answer, and just keep swinging and keep fighting through. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our product here, and who we are and what we do and what makes us different. When people ask me to describe what we are, we're one of the few, I would say, true hybrid properties out there. And again, I think hybrid cloud is sort of the, you know, the new cloud washing. Everybody is slapping the hybrid moniker on something these days, whether it's an on-premise rack full of stuff or whether it's an off-premise led service. At the end of the day, we built a software product, cloud management platform software product at our core, Extreme, and we used that software to power our own cloud-based infrastructure as a service in two focused markets, North America and Western Europe. And we ultimately GA'd, we made that software product commercially available to sell it to both enterprise and to sell it directly to other service providers that wanted to operationalize an enterprise class feature, enterprise rich feature type cloud as well. And we were very successful in commercializing that. And we kind of bookend our services on either end with advisory services and managed services. You know, the enterprise tends to require, for that type of landscape and that type of workload I described, that tends to require a very attended type system. It's just a high degree of touch, high management system. You're constantly synchronizing OS, underlying software, underlying database versioning and such. We take a lot of pride with our customer list. Again, we were start from scratch, 6-year-old company, and this is obviously not our full customer list. We have about 700 customers today, but this is illustrative of the types of customers we went after. We were elephant hunters, and you know, it's tough to do that. You really need a differentiated product and a method to go to that marketplace. Again, our offices and data centers are largely in North America and Western Europe. Again, this is 0 to 6 years, so this is sort of what defined us today, headquartered in D.C. Our product development group, interestingly, has been very successfully based in Atlanta. We actually failed in the Valley in our early years, recruiting against Google and Facebook, and those guys just proved too hard from a solution architecture perspective and things of that nature. So the center of gravity of our product design team and our architecture team is actually in Atlanta. Awesome culture, phenomenal individuals, kind of tapped into that Georgia Tech engineering community and such. And it's been very effective for us. And our developers are our own W-2 employees in both Lithuania and India. We have 50 developers in each. We're about 400 people today as a company. We had 2 data centers, one in DC and one in San Francisco that we acquired from Navisite prior to their sale to Time Warner. Smaller, agile, more power-intensive data centers, as you'll see in a moment. The density of our solution, our racks, for our cloud node racks will pull 10, 12 kWs per rack versus standard Colo 1, 2. Our HANA racks, the in-memory database, will pull 18 to 20. So it was much more important for us to have power density than a lot of space. And we spent a lot of time kind of selecting those data centers. And then one of the things we're probably most proud about is, we incorporated Virtustream in 2009. We stood up our cloud in late 2010, our infrastructure as a service cloud, on version 1 of Extreme, version 1 of our software platform. We then immediately, without really having any traction in the infrastructure as a service game, we ultimately started an effort immediately to end productize that software platform that ran our own IaaS. We ultimately wanted to scale this business through a software model. I didn't want to raise a bunch of venture capital and buy asphalt and concrete and network connections around the world. We did the original footprint so we could have credibility in the infrastructure as a service space. So that was a bet. We spent a little bit of money on what I would term a monochrome of infrastructure up front. We GA'd our software product in late 2012 and ultimately set about focusing on regional service providers. We literally went into the Middle East and competed against a number of different products out there and sold Etisalat Mobile as our first software customer. Went to Brazil, the world's largest Portuguese-speaking portal, largest content provider in Brazil is UOL. We competed against a bunch of the traditional software guys, a number of the upstarts there. We accomplished a lot through here that, quite frankly, was quite tough to do. And I still go, I'm not sure, today, if I look back on my time through college, I'm not sure I could graduate college yet. I'm not sure we could do this again. But it took a lot of hard work, a lot of phenomenal people. We have 400 of, everybody, it's sort of cliche-ish in the industry to tout or to claim having the best people in the space. And I show this, I claim it as well, but we sort of put this map next to it and use that as our credential badge from that standpoint. We did a pretty well publicized deal in 2014 where we sold our software to IBM SoftLayer to essentially power SAP environments running on SoftLayer. So we are a cloud management plane above SoftLayer's bare metal provisioning capabilities. We also did deals with Cisco and EMC. In the case of Cisco, sold them our software to help further extend the policy management and orchestration at the network layer associated with ICF up to the application layer. And same thing with EMC for vBlock. And SAP also is a customer of ours. They acquired our software to add as an orchestration layer to their HANA Enterprise Cloud system where they can federate workloads between service providers. So again, that's a true hybrid use case. That is taking down an infrastructure as a service workload in your core data center and placing it in a partner's data center to manage for either capacity reasons, geographical reasons, data sovereignty reasons, whatever. That's a real hybrid use case, and it's hard to do. So from a credentials perspective, I think we did really well through this. Forrester rated us as the top private hosted cloud company, and I really believe we punched above our weight in the Gartner Magic Quadrant. Ton of respect for Lydia. She is, in my opinion, the best analyst in the space by a mile. And we listened a lot as we went through that process, and as you've seen the Gartner Magic Quadrant evolve over the years, AWS and Microsoft have really fortified their leadership positions. There's a number of up-and-comers, and then, it's very difficult to, it's just, this is an incredible evaluation. Think of it as like a technology audit. And, having the ability to play in that game, there's only 3 companies in the world that rated above us on the ability to execute line. And as it related to completeness of vision, this is something that I hope to fully extend now as an EMC company because we'll have a $25 billion company's balance sheet behind us. It ultimately will give us the ability to build out the product and our reach a lot further. We were the youngest company included in that every year. We've been in it for 4 years, I think, and one of the few independents. So very proud of that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our software a bit. I think one of the great misnomers in the cloud is the word consumption is associated with cloud. It's really not that. And that's something that we found quite ironic and something that we focused on attacking. And people way too often attempt to associate the use of cloud computing as a utility to the electric industry. For the most part, it doesn't really work like that either, in most cases. And if I take that electrical analogy and sort of apply it to the IT computing arena, if you were to be charged by your power provider, your utility provider, by the rated capacity of your appliances, your refrigerator, your toaster ovens, your whatever, that would be sort of akin to dedicated systems hosting. Nobody attempts to sort of make the power analogy to dedicated systems, dedicated hosting. But many people in that middle area tend to try to equate cloud to the use of electrical utility computing. And if you're buying an instance size, that instance size is an allocated cube of resources. What you are going to be charged for that allocated cube of resources, whether you use it or not, whether it's lit up or not, and if it's lit up, how much of it you consume. And that is one of the fundamental misnomers in the space. That would be akin to being charged, having your home electricity bill be based upon your circuit breaker capacity, or circuits that are applied to certain zones or regions in your home for electrical use. And what we've often said is that the technology that we sought out to develop and would submit to you that we've successfully developed, fundamentally allows you to consume the cloud in a true kilowatt equivalent measurement, or how much each one of your individual appliances draw through that amp from that power generator. And fundamentally, our architecture, if you take a look at that middle case, in the case where you're using VMs to run applications in an allocated set of cubes, when you're swiping your credit card and you're buying an instance size, you're upsizing that instance size invariably to the centric requirement of that application. If it's processing speed, it's CPU. If it's IOPS, it's generally RAM. That type of analogy. And if it's memory intensive, it's RAM. And basically, you are, by definition, creating waste on one or more of the other axes on the cube to upsize the overall instance to achieve what you're trying to achieve to run those applications for their peak requirements. What our technology does, fundamentally, is sits as an abstraction layer of software above the virtual machine management layer, so above the infrastructure automation layer in the cloud infrastructure as a service stack. So our APIs will interface with vCenter, if you will, for ESX, VMware ESX, and will interface with various OpenStack distros for, for our sort of lighter, less performant required workloads and such. And what we do is we fundamentally diffuse the definitional bounds of virtual machines in an abstraction, and we ultimately go in and size and price environments to the individual requirements of sort of the four molecular components of virtual machine-based provisioning, which is compute, resident area memory, RAM storage, IOP commits, and intra-cloud network bandwidth commits, so the network that runs inside your DC. And we do this across a time phase as well. And so what we go and we will go in and is basically determine what the overall aggregate total requirement of compute is to service a landscape, the overall aggregate requirement of RAM to meet certain performance SLAs and the like. And what that does is it makes instance sizes irrelevant. This abstraction layer of software ultimately diffuses that and essentially manages cloud provisioning at the individual attribute level. We then pool those into customer pools and ultimately share those resources over an entire state of hardware and over an entire state of customers that are accessing that from a multi-tenant perspective. And so what that essentially allows us to do is define something we refer to as the cloud kilowatt. And we normalized a logical unit of measure around this for the sake of standard billing and such. And you see that at the bottom of the screen. But again, we actually just use the micro VM architecture or the micro VM definition in concert with our resource optimization and resource management algorithms that reside in the software layer to ultimately optimize the resources that you consume as a buyer. We also have the ability to when you're done using it, turn off the lights. It's like leaving the room and turning off the lights. You can go completely dark with our automation as well. We run SAP's global demo landscapes on our cloud. So we'll see a use case around midday on a Wednesday where their use is peaking. Friday nights, it literally goes dark. It literally goes to zero. So this gives you an automated way as well of only accessing the resources that you need. And a little bit of an interesting analogy that we use, and we spent so much time trying to figure out how to explain this to people. When the whole world's buying via VM and you're introducing this concept of a micro VM, we screwed up the name of it a bunch of times. We called it an infrastructure unit originally. It was terrible. But essentially, this picture really helped us sell the types of companies that you saw on that customer logo. And we're showing this on 2 dimensions. This actually exists on 4 dimensions, as I mentioned before, for all 4 attributes. We're optimizing for all 4 attributes. But if you think about the dotted lines, the outside dotted lines as a cluster of hardware, and if you think about individual hosts as the inside dotted lines, and you think of the colored boxes as virtual machines that you'd run applications in, those VMs ultimately we break down. We diffuse those definitional bounds. Then we pool the aggregate requirements of the individual attribute in each one of those virtual machines into a single customer pool, and ultimately reduce the overall overhead required to service the environment. This is one of the reasons we sold this company for $1.2 billion. So our software stack, just going to briefly go into this, as I think I'm running a little over on time. For a pretty traditional view, I would say our great strengths are in the middle 3 boxes in terms of the resource optimization. What we do with what I just showed you is super, super unique in this space. And that resource optimization layer works with our infrastructure orchestration layer. I think infrastructure orchestration is largely turning into table stakes in today's market. You just have a lot of companies that are out there doing this stuff. One of the other areas that we're really unique in is our ability to automate the management of application landscapes. Again, kind of an unsexy thing. We somewhat automate the ops side of DevOps. But what that is we automate through blueprints and through a macro orchestrator that we've built atop the Apache Brooklyn project, the ability to automate a number of interdependent tasks that you would need to go manage an enterprise application landscape. So if you're doing patching or maintenance or upgrades, serial and non-serial upgrades, start, stop, refresh, that requires a lot of enterprise IT labor. Fortune 500 companies are either employing those labor points themselves, or they're ultimately buying that through an SI, through a managed service somehow. And what the automation of that does is fundamentally reduce the amount of labor that it takes to manage these IO-intensive heavyweight enterprise application landscapes. And then we've done some really cool things in the security and compliance arena. We were the only company by Gartner that Gartner publishes a follow-on critical capabilities matrix associated with the products for those companies included in the top 15 global IaaS providers. And we were the only company to rate a 5 out of 5 in security and compliance. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we do in that area a little bit later. But fundamentally, all this matters if you can, all this engineering only matters if you're selling it to someone. And at the end of the day, that micro VM architecture working in concert with our resource optimization pools allows us as an infrastructure service provider to provide the same equivalent landscape support with 70% less compute hosts. So when I said earlier, you have to, if you're going to get in a venture-backed game, if you're going to raise venture capital and get into the cloud game, competing with the world's titans that are buying $1 billion a quarter of infrastructure, that's how you compete with it. You do it with a software product. We couldn't buy $1 billion of infrastructure a quarter. It's not even close. But what this does is it neutralizes. We essentially yield, for the types of workloads that we focus on, we will yield just a much higher ratio of workloads per host. It's fundamentally it. And so this has helped us optimize the hardware estate, and it's helped us sell the software to these large SPs that want to do the same. There's a huge residual effect. This is a slide that just basically says when you use less compute hosts, you use a lot less data center power, you use a lot less smart hands, you use a lot less HVAC, so there's quite a crescendoing effect, and the economics become very powerful. Again, ultimately the reason that we were the ability to enable the type of customer logos that we ultimately have there. The application automation arena, again, as I said, we focused largely on automating many of the interdependent and interrelated tasks that it takes to manage a heavyweight landscape. You're constantly in motion on those landscapes. So in SAP parlance, it's the basis layer. It's sort of the application admin and sysadmin that are working together. And ultimately, that automation fundamentally allows us to provide a software product that allows companies in one form or another, whether it's a service provider outsourcing that service or whether it's an enterprise consuming their own IT labor, to use fundamentally less labor. And, just from a benchmarking standpoint, you can see these types of reductions. And these are just a number of different benchmarked sort of functions that you'd attempt to perform, on the landscape. But as you can see, we take certain things that are, virtually 100% attended to virtually 100% unattended in a lot of instances. This is what we call, this area of our technology within our Extreme CMP is what we call App Director. And we're making App Director actually available as an individual product as well. And then finally, I'll talk just for a moment or two about what we do in the security and compliance arena. So again, this table stakes stuff out there. I get a kick out of, a lot of the marketing literature that, sort of makes a big deal out of two-factor authentication or certain access control or physical versus logical isolation, stuff like that. I mean, that is like breathing. If you can't do that stuff, you better not be in this business. And we took that quite a bit further. We put quite a bit of work into ensuring that we could encrypt data in motion, in rest, and in use without muting our I/O differential. Part of the other benefit of the micro VM architecture and those resource optimization pools is that our stuff flies. At the end of the day, that consumption or that micro VM architecture and resource optimization, our abilities there not only allow us to fundamentally drive the most efficient hardware estate we believe in the industry, but it allows us to control IOPS through our full architecture. Control IOPS, you control throughput, you control application latency. And we're the only guys out there that actually offer an application response time latency for apps that run on our cloud in a production environment. So we'll go to a Fortune 500 CIO, CTO and say, put your SAP apps and all that junk around it in our cloud in production. We'll give you a 500 millisecond median response time. Commercial guarantee and SLA on that. So that's something, again, that's very unique. It ultimately allows us to do and win things that we probably shouldn't as a 6-year-old company from that standpoint. And it goes well beyond the general industry around the assurance around infrastructure availability. Our point of view was, if your apps are running like crap in highly available infrastructure, what does that matter, right, at the end of the day? And similar on security, so we went quite a bit further to other areas. We actually are one of the few companies in the world that have incorporated Intel's trusted execution technology into our infrastructure as a service offering and provisioning strips. What that does is it allows you to perform attestation, integrity-based attestation at the BIOS level of the hardware. So you can ensure that resources that are accessing your nodes come from a trusted source. You can also use that technology to drive geofencing policies and such for data sovereignty rules around where data resides and whatnot. It's been very effective for us. And then finally, we've also developed a piece of technology that allows us to ingest massive amounts of sensor-based data. We call it ViewTrust, and what it does is it ultimately allows us to take point-in-time vulnerability assessment and compliance adherence processes and turn them into an automated continuous process. So we're constantly rating vulnerability down to the asset level. So if your OS system needs patching at a server sitting in a closet in a 10,000 server environment for some large corporation, we'll highlight that for you on an automated basis, provided it's being covered by the sensor. That's the reason we were rated a 5 out of 5 by Gartner in security and compliance, the only firm. And so at the end of the day, we just announced this last week. It was kind of an extraordinary day for us. We announced the EMC was acquiring Virtustream. We had a number of different options available to us. We were kind of far down the path of exploring taking Virtustream public. I had made that known out there. So we were in the final throes of selecting a bank and kind of entering that traditional 3-quarter process of hiring a bank, writing an S1, filing an S1. I felt we'd go out late 2014, early 2015. Don't love the macro markets right now. I don't hate them, but I don't love them. 6-7 years coming off the nadir of the 2009, 6-7 year bull market off the nadirs of 2009. I think gravity is going to take effect at some point in time, and I was always a little bit conscious of going out and then immediately dealing with a corrective action. But what it did was it gave us a very good idea how we would price. And there hasn't been a lot of IPOs this year. Box, Hortonworks, New Relic, that type of thing. Our presentation was very different. We actually made money on the EBITDA line. I don't have it in my DNA to run eye-watering losses. So we built it. It took us 4 years to do it. We got to EBITDA positive, and the goal was to ultimately invest every dollar that we had back into the product, into the sales capacity. And that was just our philosophy of building and running the business. Our CAGR was about 60% year over year. We built it from 0 to 100 million in 6 years, $100 million run rate in 6 years. So exiting slightly below that, our plan for this year is a bit above that. But Virtustream will form the core of EMC's new managed services business. I will run that. I'll report to Joe Tucci directly, which is quite an honor. I look at Joe as an icon in the space, and I'm really eager to learn a lot from him. Pat Gelsinger, Howard Elias, all the guys that'll be around me. It's quite a humbling, quite a humbling opportunity, and awesome responsibility. And ultimately our goal is to really scale this thing big, and ultimately be a leader in the marketplace through the differentiated capabilities that our IP, that I've described in our IP today. We just want to do this on a much bigger stage, much further reach, and the like, and we think we'll have an opportunity to do that. And then just in closing, I've got 4 minutes left, which is kind of amazing. This is the first time I've done this presentation. I've been really busy for the last 6 years, and specifically the last 3 months, so we were literally working on this last night. I've often described being a venture growth CEO as being the opposite of being an airline pilot. It's hours of terror interrupted by seconds of boredom. And I can't tell you how sort of true that is. If you're building something meaningful, it's hard. It's really, really hard. And my words of advice, and I always tend not to overdo the advice thing. I remember kind of going through many points in my career where I just wish people hadn't given me advice. But build what you know and sell it to whom you know. That's a really basic thing, but it's amazing to me how many people don't focus on that. Don't get too far away from your comfort zone, because at your core, you're capable and you're experienced and you're talented in not every area. It's impossible. So kind of know who you are, build what you know, and sell it to whom you know. That's what we did with Virtustream. We didn't attempt to be. It was so alluring. When I finally got onto Twitter in 2011, I would log on there every day, and every day I would be told I would fail because we were building a subscale IaaS. It's general. AWS is going to dominate. Easiest thing in the world is to be an AWS fan. I'm an AWS fan. That's the easy stuff. The hard stuff is to build something differentiated and create value. But we stuck to our knitting. It was very tempting to do something else, and you've seen a bunch of either failed companies or subscale exits for those that attempt to build a general purpose subscale cloud. That was lunacy, in my opinion. Going along with that, don't chase the latest shiny technology object. There is something of all the rage every day. Right now it's containers. Containers are super viable component of the stack. We use them for a lot of things, including in our own DevOps functions for around application deployment and such. But man, you're not going to pivot an entire business around that. I've seen people do that and just really make terrible mistakes from that standpoint. Make sure you can commercialize what you build. Again, in having some time as an operator out there and an investor as well, one of the things, we see a lot more great technology built than we see a lot of great technology commercialized. It's really hard to do this, and you've got to have the right DNA. You've got to have the right human beings do this. It's not a natural tendency for many. I'm an engineer by nature, and I'm a little bit perhaps different. I would define myself. I've been accused of not being able to open my mouth and not sell something, right? So you have to have people in your organization that are sales centric, that are fearless in that regard. Otherwise, you'll likely not scale. Embrace imperfection. This was something I struggled with through my first company. By my second company, I had enough scar tissue to sort of be beaten and have been beaten into submission on this, but I'm a perfectionist by nature. I'm a bit OCD. I've got to have things line up right, and I got to have numbers balance, and I torture myself and my folks with that, I think. But at the end of the day, when you're building a venture-backed company, it will be, by definition, imperfect. And if you don't embrace that perfection, you'll likely fail. You will likely just spin down a rat hole and not ultimately. You need to see the forest through the trees. As I say to people a lot of times as well, there's a very fine line between brilliance and madness as a venture growth CEO. You have to, and it's somewhat of an art form to tack around that line. Don't be influenced by the noise. As I said, I can't tell you how many people told me we'd fail at this. And a lot of days are going to suck. Just a lot of days are going to suck. But some days are going to be absolutely fucking magnificent. Thank you.